of Spain, for we've received orders for to sail for old England, and hope very shortly to see you again.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, once more to the Castle of Madness, that is the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel. Today is a very special day and a very special video, which brings to this channel two of my favorite people from Twitter. One, of course, many of you will know, all two of you will know, Marcus Cribb, who I've been talking to about the Duke of Wellington in 1815. Hi, Marcus.
Hello, good evening, welcome.
Said, pretending we hadn't already done that. And it is a great pleasure to welcome for the first time, hopefully not the last, but definitely the first time, Kate Jamieson. Hi, Kate.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. And today, highly publicized and virally shared debate, Nelson vs. Wellington, is going to take place. And to kick things off, I am going to briefly tell the story of the one time they both met. It seems too good to be true. I don't know about any of you two. It always seemed too good to be true. But it happened on the 12th of September, 1805, according to accepted wisdom. And Arthur Wellesley, Sir Arthur Wellesley, as he was at that time, was only, I think, 2 days or so back from his return trip from India, where he'd been on some pretty extended service. And Nelson was apparently, if you count it down properly, for if the 12th of September is the actual date it happened, is only about 1 or 2 days from leaving to begin his journey to Trafalgar. Both men were in a waiting room of the Foreign Office, and they were there to see Lord Castlereagh. And Wellesley, who was a name in India, was pretty much a nobody in Britain. And he walked into this waiting room, and he immediately saw this fellow waiting in there in a naval officer's uniform, and he recognized him instantly, he said, from his likeness which he had apparently seen in quite a few shop windows. Also, he recognized him because, in his words, he knew he had been maimed at one point, and he erroneously thought that he had also lost an eye. However, we should also point out that this story was recorded about 30 years later in two different places, both from the Duke of Wellington's own lips, one to John Wilson Croker and one to an artist called James Hall. And they differ very slightly, but they pretty much follow the same pattern where Wellesley engages Lord Nelson in conversation. And at first, Nelson talks all about himself. And according to the Duke of Wellington, as he was when he told this story, he was so silly that it almost disgusted him. That's in one version. However, in the other version, he says they talked for about a quarter of an hour about Calder's affair, in which he told Nelson that it just wouldn't do. His lordship had come to let the public expect greater things of the Navy. And not that that discounts the fact that Nelson might have been talking mostly about himself. Apparently, Wellesley gave some hint or impression that he was somebody, so Nelson went out of the room and asked the office clerk or something like that who the soldier is, pretty much, I've been talking to. And he returned, having been told this is Major General Sir Arthur Wellesley, and started talking to him about an invasion of Sardinia or something like that, which he wanted him to command. And Wellington later said that it was one of the most interesting conversations he had, and it lasted in total for about 1 to 2 hours. And that is my bumbling attempt to tell the story of how these two great men shared the same airspace for a period of time in 1805, just as their careers were essentially separating. And that's why it seems too good to be true. No matter what clickbait brought you here, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be trying to do our best to celebrate these two men rather than tear them down. It could be said that Nelson cannot be compared to Wellington because of the very fact that, well, Nelson died in 1805. If you do the maths on it, and I'm not strong on maths, you can, because Nelson was born about 9 years earlier, compare their lives directly by extending a few certain years after 1805 to 1814, where the Duke of Wellington roughly has achieved just about the pinnacle of his success. And so you can actually directly compare them over a certain period of time. But it does present a bit of a challenge. But I think that their legacies are so grand in British history that you can have a bit of interesting discussion about it. What do you think?
Definitely. I mean, they are the pinnacles of their career for their era. Apart from maybe Marlborough and one or two others, they're arguably the greatest military leaders of we've ever produced. And I would go so far as to argue any country's probably ever produced.
I would say they're certainly two of the most well-known and famous sort of celebrity military leaders, I guess. If you would.
Because if you have your likeness in a shop window, as they both did, that is celebrity.
They are celebrities, and if nothing else, there's a lot of pubs named either the Trafalgar Arms, the Nelson Arms, the Duke of Wellington Heads, so they're still remembered in one way or another.
Excellent. Before we get on to the interesting questions that so many of you have sent in, I'd like both participants to just tell me briefly about themselves, anything you care to share. I think most people tuning into this will probably know who you both are anyway, but on the off chance some random person shows up on my channel and wants to know who you are, would you just introduce yourselves? And I'm going to, in this, mostly defer to the senior service with priority.
Okay.
And ask Kate to go first.
Okay, my name is Kate Jamieson. I'm a naval historian, focusing mostly on the 18th century. I'm currently researching master gunners in the Royal Navy, but I have a long-held interest in Horatio Nelson, which started on HMS Victory when I was about 8. And then I was that awful teenager that constantly had all the books on Nelson and thought they knew better than every single guide on HMS Victory. Yeah, so I've just sort of carried on with that. It's a long-held interest of mine. And I went on Mastermind in 2012 with my topic of Horatio Nelson. So it's safe to say that I have a great respect for him, and he's there behind me as well. So.
I see that. I'm very jealous of that book setup. Mine is absolutely appalling. So we couldn't really ask for a better person to be talking about Nelson in this debate. And Marcus?
Yes, hello. So Marcus Cribb, I'm the manager of Apsley House and Wellington Arch in London, number 1 London, as it's popularly known. And I've been there for about 3 years. Part of that, I've expanded on the operations side of the job onto researching both the life of the Duke of Wellington and his army, principally the Peninsular War and the Battle of Waterloo, of course. But there's a lot of that I also cover about his later life. I'm fascinated about the era's tactics in the army, as I'm a reservist myself. And I used to, before this job, work down at Portsmouth Historic Dockyards alongside HMS Victory. So I've got a bit of an insight there as well.
You're more qualified to be the host here than I am.
Surely not.
I have the channel, so that gives me the edge. Anyway, thank you for that. I think that that you two are. I think everybody was right when they were saying that we've got two really excellent historians to talk about these two men. Can you then give a brief summary for anybody who has been living under a rock of the highlights of Nelson and Wellington's careers? And of course, that means we return to Kate.
Yeah, so obviously Horatio Nelson was probably one of the most famous admirals, probably in history actually, but certainly in the Napoleonic Wars. And I guess he's been celebrated ever since as this kind of pinnacle of naval supremacy in a way. He actually started off as quite a weak child, got sent to sea with his uncle, who thought that actually it'd be better if a cannonball knocked off his head, and provided for him at once. But obviously he went on, he served in the American War of Independence, in the French Revolutionary Wars, and of course the Napoleonic Wars. I guess his most famous battles would probably be Cape St. Vincent, Copenhagen, Nile, and Trafalgar, where he obviously lost his life. But he had quite a colourful life outside the Navy. He had his mistress and his secret child. He was quite a vain person and liked to sort of self-publicise. So hopefully we can cover all of these sorts of things this evening.
Mm-hmm. I think we have questions that cover most of those things, so hopefully. And Marcus, your spiel might be a bit longer, but carry on.
Yeah, so we've got a bit more of his life to talk about. But Arthur Wellesley, born Arthur Wesley, almost probably in Dublin, though he never said may man be born in a stable makes him a horse. But he was born in Ireland in 1769. Again, a very awkward child, though not a sickly one. He went to Eton and didn't succeed very well, and his own mother said of him, "What shall I do with my awkward son Arthur? For he is nothing but food for powder," which is gunpowder. And he was destined for the army. He did a bit of schooling in Brussels before they sent him to military academy in France, where he learned most of his skills, including speaking French. They purchased a commission at the time. He did a lot of then administration work for the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland before going to India for about 9 years. And he worked really quickly up the ranks there for his eldest brother, Richard, was out there in a really senior role. But he was very competent at what he did, and it was a massive period of expansionism in the British Empire, and he had during that time what he called his greatest victory at the Battle of Assaye. But after 9 years, and actually a couple of illnesses, he came back, fought at the Second Battle of Copenhagen, and was eventually given command of the Peninsular Army. Only briefly, he was supplanted, but he went back out there, and then over a period of, depending where you count, 6 to 7 to 9 years, he basically fought from Portugal into Spain, back into Portugal and back into Spain, a few times back and forth, until eventually driving the army up into the Pyrenees and through Napoleon's surrender, goes across the Congress of Vienna, comes back, faces through Battle of Waterloo, which we're currently talking about in another video, so we won't cover it too much. Faces Napoleon, close battle, but thoroughly beats him, and then he gets all the great claim and rewards. He buys Apsley House with some of his reward money, and later becomes Prime Minister twice, which not many people realise. He's centrally involved in government, oversees 3 coronations, including Queen Victoria's, and becomes one of her closest friends and advisors, and really is still central into British politics well into the 1850s. He dies at work, basically down at Walmer Castle, sadly agreeing that he'd like a cup of tea in 1852, which is a very British way to go.
It is indeed, and that is, I think, a good summary of both the men we're talking about today and a lot of the topics that will come up with questions. I suppose we could do the question and answer now, or I suppose you could discuss very slightly between the two of you who or why you think yours is the greater leader very briefly.
Go on, I'll delve in on the attack. Just like Salamanca.
Not that you're gung-ho about this at all.
No, I genuinely believe that they were both great men and great military leaders. But I think Nelson's probably slightly undermined by almost his maverick element, where like Copenhagen, where he's ignoring orders, and also his quite scandalous personal life, where he didn't seem to care about his wife. They say he had the Nelson touch, which was great, but also on the flip side, it's when he met Wellington, he was so vain to almost make him feel sick. And Wellington didn't suffer gladly, but he did also work with some very incompetent officers. So he's seen some real vanity as well. So Wellington basically never had a major battle defeated, which is in his positive, and then went on to do statesmanship and also Prime Minister. So that's why I strongly support him in this.
Okay.
Yeah, I think was it Wellington who famously said, "Beware small generals." I think it was because of the people that need that little bit of extra to compensate for their lack of fight. But I think Nelson probably had that slightly. But I'm gonna argue for Nelson because of the Nelson touch. Partly, he simplified that whole kind of chain of command. Everyone under him knew what they were doing. It kind of obviously came from John Jarvis originally. But I mean, despite his kind of recklessness, his men utterly loved him. I'm not sure you could say the same about Wellington in terms of inspiring his men, definitely. And I think whilst a lot of people sort of referred to Nelson as kind of, that foolish little fellow and vain and always trying to self-publicize, I think he spent a lot of money sending all of his stories about himself to the papers for a very, very long time. His men did like him. They were protective towards him. They loved the fact that he went in, first and fought with them, I guess. And he actually took a lot more trouble, I guess, than many other captains and admirals at the time to look after his men. And that's why I'm going to fight for him. His aggression, his care for his men. I mean, obviously he wasn't perfect. I don't think either of them were. But yeah, I'm going to go with Nelson.
Excellent. And that sets up, I think now that sets up nicely the question segment. And we're going to begin with a question that I've written them all out. So if you see cards flying around somewhere, just pick them over my shoulder.
So I'm just wondering, sorry, as we're chatting, have I got too much backlight? Because I feel like I can't see myself in the camera. But
I think it's really, really nice that you think that I know or care what is good backlight.
Still the pressure.
If you look at the screen now and you don't like what you see, make yourself comfortable.
Or just the light, but I don't want to break it with a sword.
Oh yeah, get the sword out, obviously.
What?
What?
What are we? What?
I feel like you used your arms, if I'm honest. Just any excuse.
What? Why was it necessary to draw the sword, Marcus?
The turret really high up, and I didn't want to hit it with the full weight of the saber.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that is
Turret problems.
current problems that can be the hashtag.
30 years old and I've got problems with my turret.
Okay, right. So that leads us down to the question portion of this debate, and the first one is a very interesting question that was sent in only today by Mark Urban, and he asks both of you, I think, would you agree Wellington was the greater supreme commander, combining high political and military responsibility, and in brackets, partly ability and partly because of he lived longer? And
Oh, yes.
To
That's
the Navy first. as you were.
It's tricky. I don't want to drop Nelson in it here, but I mean, if you're adding politics into it as well, then obviously I think Nelson only spoke to the House of Lords a handful of times. I don't think it went very well, any of them. I mean, I guess you could argue that Wellington kind of beat the French at their own game despite having these sort of inferior resources, whereas Nelson just had a better navy. I'm not trying to argue for Wellington here, but I think in terms of the supreme commander, as you named it, probably. But in terms of leadership, I would always go with Nelson.
Right. So basically agree with what Mark Urban's saying.
So if you, like you said, you're combining that political responsibility and the military side of it. I mean, we don't know what Nelson would have gone on to do had he not died, but I don't think it would have been political, purely because I just don't think his demeanour would have suited it very well.
Yes, I don't think so either. And now, Marcus, you may fire at will.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting that he brings up the political, because I would also argue that a lot of Wellington's role actually out in the peninsula was quite political, as well as in India, actually. He did a lot of reforms when he was governor of a couple of districts. So, yes, he certainly had to deal with the Spanish and the Portuguese, and the Spanish were quite erroneous allies. So he had that element to him as well. I don't know how much on Nelson's operations he had to deal with unwanted allies sometimes, or certainly reluctant allies at other times. That's something that Wellington did very well. I would argue that obviously he was the greater military commander, because normally for most of the opening stage of the Peninsula War, he was actually had a smaller army with a smaller number of guns. Napoleon's and the French army were quite experienced. Yes, he wasn't as loved, certainly, but probably by his men he was loved. There's a lot of commemoration, and they had quite a lot of like for him. His instant subordinates, it's quite different, as he was a micromanager and not a man of the people with them. So he wasn't always trying to be everyone's friend and close confidant with his immediate subordinates. He certainly told them what to do, but it was a very simplified and clear chain of command. He was the boss. So yes, overall, I would agree with Mark Urban, of course.
Shocking.
That was plays in my court.
The next one in line is from Jimmy S. Chen, who is doing other series of videos with me about the Russian campaign, and he also has a very good online shop at the second, and I'm going to do a plug for that right now, called Napoleonic Impressions. Do please visit that. Who do you think, both of you, had the greater impact in shaping British national and historical identity? Kate?
I'm going to go with Nelson, and that's not just because I'm sticking up for Nelson, but purely based on the immediate post-Trafalgar commemoration, I suppose. There are memorials everywhere to Nelson. There are memorials in, Barbados, in Montreal, in Edinburgh, in Birmingham, in Portsmouth, just down the road. There are so many, and the British were petitioning to have these. I think I can't remember the exact year, 1912, 1913. There was a petition to save the Victory, purely because of Nelson and Trafalgar and all of this kind of history. And I mean, if you talk about naval battles, the one that most people know, I suppose, is Trafalgar, because they've heard of it because of Trafalgar Square, or they've heard of Nelson, albeit they think he wore an eye patch, which he didn't. I'm just going to throw that. And I just think Nelson was this. partly I think he died at the right time. We needed this victory at Trafalgar, and we needed some sort of commemoration. But I think that people just loved him. Like we covered earlier, he was a celebrity, really. People had prints of him in their houses. They had plates and commemorative glasses and all sorts. I have to say, I don't know about the level of commemorative memorabilia that Wellington had. It's not something that I've ever really looked into. I'm sure he probably had some, but Nelson, and especially when he and Emma were kind of in the papers, and I guess they were the original gossip column fodder.
Yeah, it seems that way.
Everybody knew of him. I think nowadays he'd probably be in the Daily Mail sidebar on most weeks. About the Royal Navy at that time, really, and the British foothold across the world. Really, you're talking about the Navy, and Nelson will always come up.
I think that's fair enough to say. Yes. Anything to say on your side on that one?
It's a bit.
I could see you wanting to jump in.
I do disagree with.
First of all, if you answer who you think, surprise, surprise, had the greater impact on shaping national identity, and then you can comment if you like, and obviously Kate can comment back, and we'll move on.
I'm probably going to go overall Nelson, actually.
Victory.
Bipartisan. Excellent. I like it.
It's probably worked against me living in Portsmouth for over 5 years, because everything is named after somebody from Norfolk. But everything there is, and it's a huge part of like Royal Navy culture and identity. The immortal memory of Admiral Nelson, much more so than any other admiral. Whereas the Army's kind of remembers a lot more about the First World War and the Second World War. Everyone knows who the Duke of Wellington and Waterloo is, but a lot less people kind of know the detail and are less kind of passionate about it overall. There are definitely commemorations to the Duke of Wellington Arch being one, a repurposed one. It was meant to be the back gate to Buckingham Palace, but there's statues in Hyde Park. There's a lot of places named Wellington or Waterloo, even local to Portsmouth, Waterlooville, but as far as New Zealand, obviously, Wellington there. But there was lots of mugs and pipe clays and pubs. You won't struggle to find a Duke head or a Duke arms that's got the Duke's image on it. But overall, he's slightly diluted by World War I and World War II victories, whereas kind of Nelson shines through a little bit. Doesn't mean I agree that it's for the best. I think we should keep the spirit of the Duke alive, but I think Nelson just creeps that one in, and the Navy really taken him to heart. Okay.
Do you have anything to say back to that, or are you quite happy to claim the victory?
I'm happy to take that victory. I mean, I know there are a lot more. You have Trafalgar Night for a start. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have dinners to commemorate Waterloo and things like that. Trafalgar Night is such a massive thing to celebrate throughout the Navy, or anyone really that's interested in the Navy. So I'm a member of the 1805 Club, and they kind of keep this whole sort of Georgian history and memory of the Navy alive. And we have Trafalgar Night every year, and there's Pickle Night, of course, in November, and all of this kind of stems from Trafalgar. And
the Army have that. I mean, there's the Scots Dragoon Guards, for example, Waterloo Eagles on their cap badge, and the Grenadier Guards took their name from the battle. But there's other regiments that they highlight other things so much more. And I think for the Navy, like the peak, the resistance is Waterloo. Is Trafalgar, and everything after that is great, but nothing's ever been as great as Trafalgar. So I think every Jolly Jack tar knows of Nelson and Trafalgar.
Okay. The next question comes from at One More Matt, and that is to again both of you. And what would you say was the best quality of the opposing leader? So, Kate, what do you think was the best quality of the Duke of Wellington?
I have to say, I've actually only ever read one biography of the Duke of Wellington, so I'm letting myself down here. The thing that I liked the most about Wellington is that he wasn't, I mean, in comparison to Nelson, he obviously was not vain. at all. He was probably the polar opposite, really. He obviously took care of his men as much as Nelson did, I would say, from what I can tell. And he didn't go into battle wearing all of his glorified orders of knighthood and merit. And whilst I think Nelson did that partly for vanity, I think he also did it as a kind of a show of who he was to the opposing side. But Wellington certainly was not pompous, and he wasn't one of these people that wrote down his quotes to put them in the paper and publicized himself and spent fortunes telling everyone about how wonderful his victories were. And I think it was Cape St. Vincent, I think, that Nelson really didn't get mentioned at all for anything that he did, because he disobeyed his orders, and he spent ages writing to all the papers, telling everyone what he'd done, and writing to all these admirals saying, well, actually, what I did was, and I just can't see Wellington ever doing that. I mean, he was a hands-on commander in the same way that Nelson was, I suppose, and he was always there. But yeah, I guess it's that kind of non-vanity, I guess. I don't think that's the word I want. I can't think of the word that I want, but he was very cool and calm and collected in battle. I would say that's probably what I would say was his best trait.
It's a good choice, I think. Marcus, what do you think was Lord Nelson's best trait?
I think it has to come down to the famous Nelson touch. It gets said a lot. Though I would also say that having a superior navy is not a trait but an asset to the rest of the world. Having all of Kate's gunners and all these fine ships of the line, certainly he would have been crying out for when he was short of artillery. But the kind of Nelson touch, mostly because there's a great quote that when Duke held his first cabinet meeting when he was Prime Minister, he said he gave everyone their orders, and then they start asking questions. And this is him then having to go and work with politicians and career politicians who ask questions back. And he wasn't really used to that, but that's because he kind of had these kind of not blind obedience, but anyway, some of his generals were very talented, but some of the others were, I can think of a few, I won't name them, but I know I offend a few Twitter historians that follow, but there's certainly some that were just a few brain cells short of where they should have been at that point. So I think he would have wanted both the Navy, some of the captains that Nelson had, but also this kind of, I would say that some of his captains adored Nelson, whereas people liked Wellington. They thought he was probably the best general out there, but not at the beginning, certainly. So a combination of having everything on his side, and also that Nelson touch, which you just can't put your finger on.
Again, a good choice. And so the next question for both of you, and there's a lot for both of you, happily, so no one gets to hog airtime except me. Do you know what the two men thought of each other? I think this will be easier for Marcus to answer than Kate, but Kate, do you have any knowledge of what Nelson might have thought of Wellington, even though he would only have known him, if at all, prior to that meeting as Arthur Wellesley?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's that famous, I think it was only Wellington that had any existence of the record of that meeting as existed. Nelson's got no thoughts written down about it. Whether that's because he deemed it not that important, I don't know, or whether it's just because he didn't think about writing it in a letter because he had other things going on and was about to head off from Portsmouth. I don't know. But I would have thought he would have respected him quite a lot, and especially, I mean, if Nelson had survived Trafalgar, I think he would have had a great amount of respect for for Wellington. I don't know what he thought of him at the time, though. I've never seen any record of him having discussed him, unfortunately. Whereas I'm sure, well, I mean, there's that, like you said, the meeting of Nelson and Wellington, and he thought Nelson was vain and talking about himself, and it basically sums up every other record of Nelson written by pretty much every other person.
Well, at least we know it sounds fairly accurate then. But what do you think about what Wellington thought of Nelson?
Well, there's a few points that I think are quite interesting. So yes, they met. He said that the complete metamorphosis. It was his quote.
Yeah.
And he said it was the most interesting conversation he ever had. So he certainly held him in high regard. And I believe I'm right in saying that when Wellington was asked to found the Army Navy Club in St James in London, he was actually asked to found the Army Club for army officers. And it was, I believe, kind of the influence of not just the Navy, but also the memory of Nelson that he insisted it was the Army and Navy Club. So he certainly has an impression on him then. As you said earlier, I mean, their careers are kind of like 9 years different, though there's some similar paths. So if you count on to 1814 onwards, when he's at the peak of his skill and career, again, there's some more similarities. He's got his big army and he's going forth. He doesn't really write too much more because I think probably in the short term, the focus is back on him as the Duke and everyone fighting against Napoleon in the later stages and the concentration on them. And the Navy plays a lesser role. So his kind of status really comes through getting his full dukedom and then all his rewards, which I know we'll come on to later. But he certainly held him in high regards. I know, he's reciting those conversations about meeting Nelson years and years later, and there's a reason, I believe, for that, rather than just letting him be forgotten. Nelson's memory is still there, so I'd certainly say he's holding him in high regards throughout most of his career. I probably would go so far as to assume Wellington's opinion, which I don't like to do very often, that he would probably assume that he would have liked to, Nelson not to have just lived, but for them to have had a conversation later in life as well.
And obviously from it had to be sort of a one-sided answer there, I'm afraid, Kate, because obviously Nelson had a lot in his mind, and although he did give Wellington the time of day, after he found out who he was, suggesting that he might have heard something of him. No, we can't really know for sure. We are on a similar question bend here. What do you think, both of you, were both men's greatest mistakes? We go back to Kate.
I think Nelson had a lot. I think probably if we're talking about it from a military perspective, it would probably be Tenerife, because it went utterly wrong, or his time in Naples. I think some more contemporary biographers have gone as far as to call him a war criminal, which doesn't sit well for most people who obviously are fans of Nelson. But I think if we were going to go into that, I think Naples probably would be his biggest mistake. Whether it was a mistake or an error of judgment, I'm not sure how we would phrase it. Probably the latter. I think he very much went with what Emma was sort of telling him that the Queen had said at the time. For those that don't know, essentially people were given a pardon. Nelson ignored it. The Queen of Naples, Maria Carolina, who was actually the sister of Marie Antoinette. So I think it would have to be Naples, really, because when the royal family left for Sicily, which is obviously where Nelson and Emma became a couple, as it were, Naples was declared a republic. Those of people with these republican sympathies joined the French, and the king sent this army under the command of Cardinal Ruffo to crush this uprising, and there was a treaty signed by him with the rebels that would let them go unharmed. Nelson went against that completely, and a lot of these men were actually arrested, imprisoned, and executed on instructions from the king and queen. And part of that was due to Emma's very close friendship with the Queen, and also her influence on Nelson. If you're going back to politics, the government were not very happy with Nelson about this. He actually got recalled to Britain because they were so appalled. And like I said, Maria Carolina, her sister, had been executed in 1793, Marie Antoinette, I think. And yeah, they basically just were not any fan of the rebels. And Nelson, like I said, a lot of people see him as a war criminal. if you look into it, because it was actually appalling what he was. People were being told that they were allowed to leave, and then Nelson was having their transport ships seized and taking them under armed guard. And I think one of the guys was asked, he specifically asked to be shot, and Nelson basically said no. He also didn't give him any time to prepare for his execution and just hung him on one of the ships in front of everybody. And like I said, all of these other people would be supposed to be going for trial, and Nelson sent them for execution and didn't intervene at all. And I think if you're going to go with what his biggest mistake was, I think that would be the one. And actually, there's a really interesting book that's been written recently on that by, I have to check, Jonathan North, called Nelson at Naples, which covers it in a lot more detail than any other Nelson biography ever has. And it's, I would say, quite controversial, because obviously Nelson is seen as this heroic figure, but actually that whole time period in Naples puts a big stain on his character. And I think that's what I'd go with as his biggest mistake.
Dark time for Horatio indeed. And so
A bit there.
No. Well, it's a subject that you do need to explain, because actually we have another question that roughly touches on it as well, which you may just give the same answer to. But yes, I think it's good to explain that a little bit, because Marcus has had a few longer explanations of things, so why we can be fair about this. So, Marcus, actually, you have a lot more to choose from.
Yeah.
But what would you say the Duke of Wellington's greatest mistake was? Of course, as Kate said, the question's a little ambiguous as to whether it's referring to military or political when it comes to Wellington. So you may have to do both.
I might have to do both. Militarily, personally, I would say the two great sieges, because I wouldn't count San Sebastian as much, because that was Lord Graham. But Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz. He admitted, Wellington, that he was not very good at sieges. It was quite medieval, just like surround the city, starve them out as best you can, and then just batter away at the walls and then charge in. But mostly I'm referring to them because, a bit like Naples, of the slaughter that took place afterwards. Charles Esdale's done some work actually saying there was actually Spanish on Spanish murder and looting that was taking place. And the fact that the governors of the town didn't surrender the city, so they were like fighting through the city. But because of the terrible scenes that took place towards civilians, I'd say both those.
That is interesting that you choose Badajoz and Ciudad Rodrigo, because I would have sworn if you were going to give as Wellington's biggest military mistake as a siege, you would have gone for Burgos.
Could have gone for Burgos. It was purely both the fame and the infamy of them, I think.
Right.
Why I chose them.
Okay. You are the guy. You're the Wellington guy. That's an interesting choice.
He basically, what I could just say there, then sieges. He just wasn't very good at sieges. He found them frustrating. Burgos too, and he's just kind of throwing men into a hole where there's cannon and musket and even mines aimed at them. So he just wasn't very good at sieges. Was one of his flaws. I would go with it's quite a boring beige one really, but Catholic emancipation was very good that he did, and then he didn't reform it far enough to voting and seating reform in the House of Lords and in the House of Commons. So it was before the Great Reform Act. So very few people had the vote. Famously, the Ross and boroughs and the House of Lords, the system wasn't perfect by any means. So he refused to reform that because he was an aristocrat in the House of Lords, and he was like an ultra Tory almost. So he didn't reform that. He did do Catholic emancipation, so a lot of people got a lot of rights in Britain, which is great. He didn't take it far enough, and that even led to the stones being thrown through Apsley House windows and things like that. So he was too conservative for a conservative, basically, as a politician. So, but yeah, sieges. He just was not a siege general at all.
Right. So for Wellington, you say his sieges, specifically those two you mentioned, and as a politician, the reform bill.
Reform bill not going through with it. Yes, it basically forced him to stop being prime minister for a while.
Because it is a huge subject, so I applaud you for not going into that. Okay, yes, very, very interesting answers there. And last one, the mistakes question was given by Z White History. That's Zach White. Thank you, Zach. And so, Kate and Marcus, which was the worst husband?
That's a great question.
Who's going to go first?
Navy first.
Ladies and senior service first.
Fine. I mean, I think everyone knows Nelson was not a good husband. I think we can get that one out in the air from the off. Nelson had married Frances Nisbet quite a few years before Trafalgar. She was a widow at the time with a son who actually also joined the Navy and was at Tenerife with Nelson, took him off when he got shot in the arm. And at this point, I guess Nelson was kind of a young officer. Not many people knew much about him. She had a very rich uncle, and it was a very suitable marriage. She probably wasn't as, I don't know what the word I want to use is, fun, perhaps. When you read accounts of her and of Emma, they are very different people. She was very sensible. Emma was flighting around hosting parties for Nelson in the streets and basically trying to get his attention in any way she could, despite actually being married to William Hamilton at the time, who was the ambassador in Naples. But for a time, I think it was working out quite well for Nelson. They lived in Norfolk while they were at peace, and whilst Nelson was writing hundreds of letters trying to escape to sea as much as possible, there wasn't much going on, and it was fine until he went to Naples and he met Emma Hamilton, who was quite famous in her own right, actually. There's a really, really good book been written about her called England's Mistress, which gives you a lot more insight into her background. And I guess she was kind of one of the first women people would buy pictures of to put on their walls. She was beautiful, and she had, I think, what were they called? I can't remember the name of it now, but she used to sort of put on these attitudes, scenes of Greek paintings and Roman paintings and act them out. And it all seems a bit strange to us today, but Nelson enjoyed it and thought she was one of the best women he'd ever met. But yeah, he wasn't very nice to Fanny Frances Nisbet after he'd met Emma. And at one point he basically said, look, Emma is the best woman I've ever met. She makes me very happy, and never really spoke to her again. I think he kept her with money and sort of did his duty to her, but never saw her again. Which is actually really sad, because Frances Nisbet went to Norfolk and looked after Nelson's elderly father, and she was probably quite a nice person, actually. And she got pretty messed about by Nelson, who obviously then went on to have a child with Emma named Horatia, but they hid it for a while and pretended that it wasn't their child. I mean, it wasn't the most subtle of names to call.
No, not really.
Trying to hide it, but eventually they made no secret of hiding it, and Nelson wrote this letter saying that he wanted Emma and Horatia to be provided for when he died. Obviously nobody did that because they didn't agree with it, and Emma died in poverty in Calais a few years later. But I think, yeah, Nelson was not a nice husband in any way, shape or form.
Very, very fair assessment. Marcus?
Well, I mean, Wellington was not a good husband. But I think on this one, I will concede that Nelson was definitely the worst husband on the bad husband scale. Whereas Wellington had Kitty. And
this is Catherine. Yeah, I was going to say it's not a cat.
So he had Catherine Pakenham, Kitty, always known as, and they had a really troubled marriage. He proposed before he went out to India. He then kind of saw it back through, and famously, when he saw her pretty much on the wedding day, he said, "She's grown ugly, by Jove." So it didn't start off well. She wrote him loads of letters all his time away, and in her diary. She writes what she's up to one day, and then she leaves the other page blank, so she can put in what he's up to from his letters. And you'll see that nearly always it's blank, because he just didn't write to her that much. And he was a prolific letter writer. He certainly had affairs, but they were kind of more fraternizations rather than anything more serious. Wellington held women in really quite high regard. He had a lot of friends' wives that he talked to. And he often talked to women quite an equal footing, especially for the era. and really kind of held women's opinion quite high. I'm thinking of ladies like Harriet Arbuthnot. Whereas Kitty, basically even Harriet said she is a fool, and she didn't really then Harriet goes on to describe that Kitty wanted to make Wellington happy but didn't know how. So in the same way with like Emma Hamilton and Fanny, that Kitty kind of wanted just to stay inside a house, and all of a sudden she's the most famous man in Britain's wife. He then becomes prime minister. He's bought this beautiful house in London, is holding like the king's coming round for dinner all the time, and all the parliament, and she's just not made for that role. So, but he's got the reforming thing that actually they do kind of stay with each other. And when she dies, he's there at her deathbed. There's a beautiful bit that he wears a locket round his bicep with her that she gave him, and literally on her deathbed in her last moment, she reaches up his arm apparently and feels for it and smiles. And they said they found each other again in those last few moments. So it's kind of, though she died way before him, it's kind of got a happy ending, that she died in his arms. So Wellington was not a good husband, but I think he did love Kitty. They didn't show it very well to each other.
Mm-hmm. So both not exemplary husbands, but on the whole, I think we have to give Wellington as a slightly less worse husband.
That's how I also say,
Okay.
very good question. It's nice to get something that's not on the military.
It is nice. We have from F. Jastrzemski. I hope I pronounced that right. What if Wellington and Nelson had swapped roles? So how would a General Nelson have fared against Napoleon's army, and how would a Admiral Wellington have fared against the French Navy? I suppose we have to be fair here and accord each one the necessary ability to command. Because if you put Wellington in charge of a fleet, first, I'm sure he would have done a lot of reading on the subject, but I'm not sure if he'd have known what exactly to do. Kate.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the officers in the Navy started very young, and they had to know what they were doing. I think it's quite widely accepted that you could sort of buy a commission in the army. You couldn't do that in the Navy. You had to know your heads and your halyards. You had to know how to move a ship and maneuver it. Like, if you didn't, you would stand no chance, basically. That's not me saying that the army is the easier option by any means, but definitely being able to command a fleet and knowing how ships work and the weather and the tides and the winds, you had to have that experience. I don't think Nelson would have been very good in the army, partly because, like I said, he started off as quite a frail child. I don't think the army would have been on his list at all. He only really went to sea because his uncle took him kindly as a captain's servant, and I'm not sure he would have been able to yomp across battlefields. I'm sure he could ride a horse, but I don't see him getting on with the land aspect that well, I suppose. And actually, his land, I wouldn't call them land operations, but if you look at Tenerife, it went appallingly. I guess you'd hope that he had someone guiding him in the way that Jervis guided him in the Navy to help him in the army. But, you know, a Navy and an army are very different things. The Navy is a very sort of small, close-knit, intimate environment on a ship where you really have to know what every single person is doing. And I'm sure the army is exactly the same. Everyone has to know what everyone is doing. But on a ship, that's very, very important, probably more so. And I just don't think Nelson would have been a very good soldier. I think if he was ignoring orders on a battlefield, it would go very wrong very quickly. I think you get that when you're on a ship, you're kind of in a bubble, I suppose. Whilst you're all still being fired at, you're in this sort of slightly protected area. I don't think that he would have fared very well on a battlefield as much as he would at sea, with that sort of protection and security around him.
Okay. Marcus, how would Wellington have done on the opposite?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, assuming he went through the training because he went to military academy, so he was a proficient sailor.
Yeah, so we have to kind of give him that, because otherwise he wouldn't be in command.
But I think he completely, this awkward boy for powder fell into the role that he was meant to have. He was such a micromanager, especially on the battlefield, and someone who wanted to be everywhere, all involved. I think he would have really struggled at sea because he would have wanted to basically get his ship and sail it up and down the line, telling everyone how they're going to command their ship. So I don't think that would have gone very well to Trafalgar. He basically wants to be in both columns at both at the same time. I think it was Salamanca where he gets on his horse. He was a great horseman. He would probably would have been on the bow rattling a saber, kind of Jack Sparrow style, rather than looking dignified on the sloop deck. So probably wouldn't have done that well on that. What he did have on his side that maybe I see less of Nelson's biography is he was a great commanding all of the war, and including the logistics and the politics. He would have been a capable admiral. I just don't think he would have been comfortable within those 4 walls of a wooden ship. I think he would have gone a bit crazy.
True, and that's an interesting point as well, because as an admiral, he would have had to have dealt with very few allies in a command situation, actually. And Nelson would have had to have put up with the Portuguese and the Spanish and Bourbon Royalist French, Dutch, Germans, and it would have been very interesting to see.
They both had to deal with the Spanish, just in very different ways. The Wellington a reluctant ally, to Nelson less so.
I think from what I've read, Wellington was not one for delegating at all. I think I remember reading something the other day, sort of because I was doing some last minute kind of Wellington prep, saying that he had learnt to control his battles personally and not to trust his subordinates, which is the polar opposite of Nelson, who basically made sure everyone knew what they were doing, or at least had an idea of where they were going, so that they weren't constantly having to look out for signals. Very different. I'm not sure Wellington would have liked it very much at all.
Very different command styles. I'll agree with that. Yeah, he liked to just tell them what they do down to a really low level, like before Waterloo. He's telling individual regiments where they're going to bivouac that night, and it's just unnecessary detail in a way, but he wanted to make sure everything was correct so that he could win. So it worked in his mind. It just meant he was doing ridiculously long hours.
Okay. I think that came out slightly in favour of Wellington, but not much between them particularly. I don't think they've shone in either service if they had to swap roles. So that actually does answer, from Wellington's point of view, the next question, actually, Marcus, because the next question coming from Tony Beals is that did they micromanage or did they delegate, and why? And you've just explained basically that Wellington was a serious micromanager and did not like to delegate for most of his career. So we might just let Kate field this one for Nelson. Kate, did Nelson micromanage, or did he delegate, and why?
I think he delegated quite a lot, actually. I mean, especially at the Nile. I mean, his captains became known as his band of brothers, because he dined with them, he communicated with them, he simplified that kind of chain of command and communication structure up and down. And like I said, everyone kind of knew what they were doing, and previously people would have signals going left, right and centre, and Nelson wanted to avoid that, really, because he wanted to simplify everything. And I think the most famous quote that everyone always uses for Nelson, apart from England expects, is no captain can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside that of his enemy. And all of his captains knew that. They realised his intentions, they knew what they were doing. And I think it was at Trafalgar, Collingwood actually said, I wish Nelson would stop signalling, thinking he's too many. But all of his captains knew what they were doing. Nelson's aim was to make sure that those captains felt like they had those responsibilities, I suppose. And it worked very well. And even today, people use Nelson's leadership style as a kind of template, I suppose, for how to treat people. He made sure he looked after his men. His men liked him. His captains knew what was going on. And yeah, I mean, the Nelson touch is very, very well documented, really, and with good reason, I think.
I think that's what's so interesting about these two men, is they had such different styles of leadership from a military context.
Yeah.
Wellington's completely worked, and it doesn't actually belittle his officers. Some of his officers, he does delegate experience to You've got Graham and Hill off fighting their own battles and their own little wars down in the south of Spain often. But yeah, they're certainly really two different men and styles.
Yes, I think I remember Wellington saying on one occasion when some of his generals had got a bit of a pounding that they really don't know what they're doing unless I'm there to tell them, roughly. And part of that could actually come back to what you were both saying about the delegation, was that, and also how they might do as a general and an admiral, because the Navy did require everybody to know what to do with his own ship, and each one of those ships had excellent gunnery standards. So when Nelson said, you can't do very wrong with placing a ship again alongside the other, he knew exactly what would happen when that happened.
Yeah.
Whereas Wellington had no assurance whatsoever. If he put a brigade in front of another enemy brigade, that general would not just lose completely.
And the problem he had, Kate touched on it earlier, that lots of the officers, and Wellington really hated the purchasing system where they came up. Now, Wellington basically served very little time as a lieutenant, captain, and major. He went very quickly to lieutenant colonel, so it worked in his favour. But then actually he disliked it because you had people coming in at very high rank with very little experience, and sometimes, I mean, they had no training for most of them, apart from if they're engineers or artillery. So you ended up with people who their family, or certainly their brothers in Wellington's case, were senior, and so you get promoted quickly, and it certainly worked against his army sometimes.
I think that's one thing the Navy at the time did very, very well, actually, because
examinations.
Yeah, and it was merit based. You know, you had to actually perform, and you had to do well. And that's not saying there weren't a few people who managed to wangle their way in with family connections, such as the princes, for example. But I think I remember reading recently that actually only about 17 or 18% of the Navy at the time had got in by that means. The majority had perhaps joined with family friends as very young boys, but they still had to work their way up, and they had to pass their exams, and they had to be ready for those exams. I think to go from midshipman to lieutenant, you had to have 6 years at sea to make sure you knew everything you were doing. And I think partly with Nelson's leadership that came into play as well, because he wasn't, he was promoting his captains and helping with his captains and helping them. When he had those dinners and sat them down, he was going through tactics with them, and he was going through all these different ways that you could sort of use seamanship to your advantage, and sort of mentoring them, I suppose you'd probably call it now. It was that kind of advocating that, a we will rather than a you will, and trusting them and giving them that power, I guess, to prove themselves.
It is the Nelson touch.
Yeah, exactly.
The whole system was probably quite almost forward thinking for its time, really, for the Navy.
Could well be. I think there's a great amount of pride
the
in
army
the
system,
professionalism of the Navy.
Yeah, the army system of purchasing hadn't really reformed since way before Marlborough's time at all. So it wasn't really doing them any favours. And there was actually quite a few generals wanted to reform it, and quite a few generals that wanted to oppose it because it kept the hierarchy and the aristocracy in power.
Who was the better served in terms of their subordinates, and which one's subordinates were more successful? That's from @ColQ Grant.
Oh, Colquhoun Grant, by chance?
I think so, yes. Kate?
I think it's a tricky one, because Trafalgar was really the last major battle at sea for the Navy at that time. I mean, people went on and they fought the Americans in the War of 1812, and they,
Navarino.
Pardon?
Navarino.
Yeah, there were a few things going on, but I just don't think they would have had there was no way they could prove themselves in the way that Nelson did. There was not that opportunity afterwards, and certainly captains under Nelson made a name for themselves. Thomas Troubridge, probably the one that I would use as a standout example. He was at Cape St. Vincent with Nelson. He was at Trafalgar, and he's very well thought of, and an excellent seaman by all accounts. But I just don't think they had the opportunities to go ahead and prove themselves in a naval theatre, really, in the sense that you would have been able to earlier on in the French Revolutionary or the Napoleonic Wars. Whereas obviously post-Trafalgar, well, post 1805, if you're in the army, you've still got plenty of campaigns going on for your men to be able to prove themselves. And even after Waterloo, the army's still fighting, aren't they? Really?
I think that's fair to say, definitely, because afterwards they were used a lot in gunboat diplomacy and bombarding cities and blockades and things like that. So
for a long time after Trafalgar, and I mean they were for a long time prior to Trafalgar. And actually, I would say that blockades had as much of an influence on the French as fighting at sea, if not a little bit more, because it stopped them being able to go to sea and stopped them being able to train and practice and get that experience that they needed.
Whereas Marcus, what of Wellington? What are the names we need to know?
I know. I was thinking during that, and I was like, there are so many names, and if I start naming some and don't mention others, it's going to offend certain historians.
I don't think you should need to mention them all.
Yeah, that's the problem. There are so many. I'm thinking, actually, just because we're doing us talking about Waterloo on our other podcast thing, I'm thinking about Delancey off the top of my head, Murray, and well, there's quite a lot. But so I'm thinking of Beresford, who's standing in for Hill, and at Albuera, he barely pulls a victory out the bag. He's very well served overall. I can only think of a handful that are in the negative, and it's a whole big subject for Wellington, his brigade and division commanders. But overall, he's quite well served, apart from sometimes not in the cavalry as well as he wanted until Stapleton Cotton's there, because Uxbridge goes away. And I know I'm going to offend people with saying that he's got Stuarts there in command of his cavalry. He doesn't really shine very well. Well, they go on and they become Governor General of Canada and the Channel Islands and Gibraltar, and so there were like cities, streets, and places named after these men that are very much in the common vernacular.
I think we could definitely say that both men served very well with the officers that they had to work with, and so we move on. I think to I think this one is probably more directed at Kate, but Marcus, I think you can chime in after, if you want. If you think it's for Wellington as well. Was Nelson's love of battles greater than Wellington's dislike of them? That's from @Diaries Empire.
That's a good one. Mostly because I don't know how much Wellington hated his battles as in the sense of putting them on a scale, if that makes sense. I think for Nelson, his love of battles, if we would call it that, was more a sense of trying to annihilate the French. And I think those are the exact words he used on multiple occasions. He was quite forthcoming with it, and I think he managed it at Trafalgar, albeit he obviously died there. And the Nile was probably was a fantastic victory, really. If he wanted to achieve that, which he did. I mean, he did. I would call it his love of battles, particularly. I think him, it was a way to distinguish himself and to better himself and to get his name known, because that was a lot of what he was doing. Like I said, he was a very, very good publicist for himself. And even Cape, I think it was Cape St. Vincent, one of the press somewhere basically came up with this idea that there was a recipe for defeating the Spanish fleet. And they called it Nelson's Olla Podrida, and it was, take 2 third rates and a first rate and smash them together. And Nelson loved it to the extent that he copied it out freehand in letters that he wrote to everybody, saying, "Look at this! Isn't this great? Look what I did." And I don't know how much of it was his love of fighting as much as his love of making this name for himself and, trying to just give the French one, really. Actually, especially when you read the letters towards the end of his life, he was actually looking far more forward to sort of being at Merton with Emma and Horatia, and writing letters about how he looked forward to being in the gardens and walking with them, and sort of trying to have this slightly more normal life, which obviously didn't happen, unfortunately. So it changed definitely throughout his life, I would say.
The feeling seems to be very much a Frenchman is still a Frenchman, as a certain quote goes.
I think it was Nelson. Yeah, you must hate a Frenchman as you do the devil.
Yes. So that's interesting. Yes, I think that the question was a bit pointed when it said he loved battle, but it was really his arena where he could shine.
Exactly. Yeah.
Marcus, you can therefore explain Wellington's feeling about battle.
Yeah, well, I've also come in on right on the end point that Wellington never hated Frenchmen as well. He's not going out seeking glory, I wouldn't say, but I also wouldn't say he's going out seeking battle either. And yes, eventually does he hate battles? Because after Waterloo, famously, and I always find it quite emotive that after he's met Blucher near La Belle Alliance, he rides back across the battlefield, and that's within, it's about 2 by 3 miles of the battlefield, but even smaller than that. There's about 50,000 men of both sides dead and dying, and he sees a lot of it personally. Like Delancey and Uxbridge are wounded next to him. He can't famously go to bed because Gordon's dying in his bed and his table's having medical exams, and that's when he's given the butcher's bill by his surgeon, and he weeps, we think, for well over half an hour. And the surgeon notes that he's got tears rolling down dust-filled cheeks. And he says he'll never fight a battle again.
Okay, so moving along. So this one is from a couple of people. About 4 people asked roughly this question. And if Nelson had died earlier or had lost Trafalgar, yeah, right. How might this have affected Wellington's ability to operate, essentially? It's a fairly big question in itself, because it refers not just to Wellington but all of land operations and practically. So
I think it's a tricky one, because you also kind of need to, if you think about Trafalgar, actually the French had a fleet in Brest and a fleet in Toulon and Rochefort that didn't even leave and turn up. I think it's a tricky one. When you come to Trafalgar, it wasn't really the be all and end all, certainly Britain. It would have sustained that survival for Napoleon at sea and would have proved more of a, it wiped out that threat of invasion for Britain, certainly, by sea. And there was, we didn't get invaded. There were no rogue Frenchmen turning up in Pembrokeshire anymore. But equally, I think you need to think about what else was going on. I think, was it Austerlitz that was a month after Trafalgar? And there was plenty of other things going on other than the Navy. The Navy was a pretty crucial part of it, but certainly I think they would have been fine. They wouldn't have been fine. I don't know how to word it really.
It wouldn't have been the end of the Napoleonic Wars.
And equally, you see people saying, "Oh, Trafalgar ended Napoleon," blah blah blah. But actually, the Napoleonic Wars went on for 10 years after Trafalgar, which says everything that you really need to know. It stopped Napoleon attempting anything at sea, but it didn't end the Napoleonic Wars by any stretch of the imagination. And like I said, blockades played a huge part, really, I would say, in the defeat. And the army was crucial. I know people try and play off the army versus the navy and which was more important, and I think you needed both, but I think Wellington did a very good job without the navy. Quite a few of the questions that came in on Twitter seemed to imply that the navy was a glorified taxi service.
Yeah, there was a few like that.
Strangely, from ex-navy guys who seem to word it in a way to imply it's a taxi service.
Seems a little bit self-defeating, doesn't it?
Even if Napoleon had taken down Britain, he still had Russia waiting for him.
Just another brilliant decision on Napoleon's part. Marcus, I think that Kate has sort of answered the question there. I'm not sure what else we could really say about that.
I genuinely agree. It wasn't the end of things, and it wasn't even the end of the beginning, because the Peninsular War itself hadn't even begun, and the Napoleon's later campaign. So it was very much like the end of one chapter, and there's a lot more going on. I think Britain, with its advantage of having a huge moat around it, basically with the forts and having a Channel fleet, and the Channel fleet we'd always spent a lot of effort on our threat of invasions being relatively low at the time, luckily. And I think that if it wasn't for Trafalgar, there would have been another admiral that would have at least been able to see off invasion. I would never call the Navy a taxi service, as some people were implying. But when you're talking about ferrying people over, we said, how would we get out to the peninsula? Well, actually, we used merchantmen. We used armed merchantmen. We didn't use the Navy. The Navy were not a taxi service. So we didn't rely upon the Navy to take our army around the world very often. The Navy did do that, but we had auxiliaries who could also do that for us. So yeah, I can see salty Matlows kind of shaking their fist, but no, it's a little bit more complicated. The army had a good system of getting around the world, and we were in India at the same time, and we didn't have too many problems. So
hurrah for the border of Transvaal.
The best.
Yeah, I think that answers that very well. And it also answers the question that followed that, which is pretty much the same. Could Wellington have operated in the continent without Nelson? But the answer is there for everybody. It's a bigger question than that. It's much more complicated than that. And if you view them both in isolation, it doesn't make any sense.
I think you have to look at the French. I mean, by the time Trafalgar happened, the French were really struggling. I mean, they'd been mutinies because they were being sent to sea with no clothes. And they were in a terrible state. And the Spanish did some training while they were in Cadiz. It's documented. But if you look at the British fleet and the French and the Spanish fleets in terms of them actually being able to get to sea, they couldn't, because we blockaded them, and they didn't have supplies and they didn't have clothes. And actually, by that point, the French had also got rid of their corps of seamen gunners, which is dropping in my gunners again. But they used to have a really well-trained kind of almost artillery company of gunners that went to sea, and they were very well drilled. And then they got rid of it when the revolution happened, and then suddenly they went, oh, this is a problem. And you can't just look at the Navy and the Army. You have to look at everything that was going on at the time everywhere to be able to get that context and actually work out what could have happened.
Mm-hmm. I seem to recall actually that Corps of Gunners was briefly reformed, but ended up being taken to Russia or something stupid like that.
I mean, I was thinking that there was a lot of
cannoneers, bombardiers,
Imperial Guards serving on board ships as Marines, but then later on there was a lot of Marines in the peninsula serving as skirmishers and things like that. So it was a bit too interchangeable. I think Napoleon wasn't taking it seriously enough.
Right, this one here, this next question, it could be quite difficult, and I'm not even sure if it's possible to answer from, again, Nelson's point of view. And it is from Errant Dave, at Errant Dave. How did the disparity in the political talents affect the performance as military leaders?
I mean, Nelson didn't really involve himself in politics hugely. He wasn't. If you look at Naples, the government were not happy with him at all. I mean, I've already touched on it, but they recalled him. They wanted no part. They didn't want to be aligned to it in any way, shape, or form, and that's not a good good position to be in. And maybe not so much in the government, but if you look at the Admiralty as its own kind of administrative entity, that period where Nelson was sort of in disgrace because of the Emma situation, and he's constantly going, give me a ship, let me go to sea, etc., etc. And they just wouldn't give him one. And at that point, he wasn't actively involved. He certainly wasn't involved in it in any way as much as Wellington was. And I don't think he would have been post-Trafalgar. I imagine he would have probably made an earl or something, and potted around being miserable at not being able to go fighting, and generally being a bit of a pain in the ass, probably.
Oh, Tom. Yeah, it is a very difficult question for certainly you to answer, Kate, because of what we've already said about that. It's even actually quite difficult, I would think, for Marcus, because although he had to deal with politics when he was the general officer commanding in Spain and Waterloo, they were very much the politics of alliances and not what I believe this question is talking about at home.
I mean, by that point, Wellington had already been a member of Parliament for the separate Irish Parliament. He came back because of the Treaty of Sintra, and that was actually present in Parliament. And then he wanted to go into politics, I say later, and became Prime Minister twice. So disparity, yes, huge disparity, definitely. And I just want to come in on Wellington's own defence against himself almost, where he always gets labelled as a really bad politician. And quite lucky to hear now Lord William Hague's speech for the Duke of Wellington's birthday last year. And it was actually kind of saying about underneath Wellington, you had so many of the reforms by Peel, which we've got the Peelers, and actually should they not be the Wellingtonites? They basically established the police force. They removed the death penalty for so many acts that actually it was really modern for its time. Never mind putting in the Catholic emancipation and letting all these people, just because of their religion, become fully classed citizens. So there's a real positive to Wellington's political career, and always he's labelled as a really bad politician. Whereas actually, if you really imagine it, he's adequate.
So here's an interesting one. One of my favourite questions, which is sent in by late Lord Chatham, who is your friend and mine, Jacqueline Wrighty. How well might Wellington and Nelson have got on in an amphibious operation? Kate?
I mean, I'm going to have to use Tenerife as an example because it didn't go well. Nelson, he had a few operations where he actually took part in land. I think San Juan one, but obviously that got cut short because he got ill, which seemed to be a concurrent thing throughout his entire life. He was constantly ill. But Tenerife was just a disaster. They'd been planning it for, I think, 3 months. They had absolutely no intelligence apart from some guy who'd been there 5 years ago, who was like, well, when I was there 5 years ago, this is what there was. And they turned up with these ladders, and I think they had some artillery officers and a howitzer, and they had all these plans for bombarding Tenerife. And for a start, if you look at Tenerife on a chart, you've got this massive Atlantic swell coming in, which is just difficult. I'm not saying that that's where Wellington would have helped him on any amphibious operation, but I'm just using it as an example because it just went so badly. And they tried to take them in these boats and then realised they'd got the distances completely wrong, and they were actually a mile and a half out still by the time it was daylight. And then they completely lost the advantage of surprise and went back. And then Nelson goes, well, if I was leading it, it would have been a completely different story. So then he led it. Within about 2 minutes, he'd end up being shot in the arm and dragged off back to the ship. Trowbridge was taking men up with these massive artillery pieces up this mountain. People were dying because they were dehydrated and exhausted. And it was completely pointless because the range of the guns was entirely insufficient and didn't work. They just missed everything. On top of that, they then went down into the town, didn't understand the streets, didn't have a clue what was waiting for them, took cover in a church, and then basically had to surrender. And it just went very, very wrong. And there's a really nice story that actually afterwards Nelson wrote to the Spanish guy that was in charge. I can't remember his name. And they swapped like a cheese platter or something. But he gave him some cheese, and they wrote letters to each other. And there's a letter about cheese in this museum in Tenerife from Nelson.
Nelson's cheese.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how well they would have worked together, purely because, like we've already said, they had very different leadership styles. And I mean, leadership is partly something that you either have it or you don't. I don't think it's something that can be developed in every single person, because some people aren't that. They're just not naturally born leaders, I guess. But when you've got two polar opposite people trying to command things, and I think Nelson probably would have thought his way was best, even if it wasn't. And quite clearly in this example, it absolutely was not. And I'm not sure how well he would have listened to Wellington. Actually, I think we should do this way. That's my thoughts on it. I'm not sure whether you would agree.
Well, I definitely think, I was thinking about like splitting it, like their personalities. I think they just don't think they would have got on very well. I think if keeping the fact that, say, Nelson survived after Trafalgar, I think it's a hypothetical, but Wellington would have been impressed with his fame, but I don't think he would have fawned over him in the way that some of his captains and his junior officers would have. So I don't think Nelson would have liked that, because the Nelson touch wouldn't have quite worked on Wellington. It took a lot more than that to impress him, and I just don't think they would have got on, because Wellington very much, by that point he's now a senior commander, he would have wanted to do it his way. And hearing how he's going to fight on land from a shipborne commissioned officer is just not going to rub off. He would just very much relegate him to somewhere in his aide-de-camps, when I want you, I'll come and get you. And that's not going to go down very well. That said, Wellington in amphibious, Copenhagen, 1807. It's kind of, he was shipborne. And then I was kind of jokingly thinking about crossing the Douro. I think he could do amphibious ops. It just wasn't as usual. I just think those two men in a room would have been really interesting if it was 1814 or something like that, and how they would have got on. I think they both would have thought they were the big cheese, or both of them were, more accurately.
Okay, yeah, I think that would have been a very interesting room to be listening in on. What did Nelson and Emma's house in Morton look like from Pickle 1805?
Well, it doesn't exist anymore, which is so. I think Nelson basically, I mean, it was the same as his estate in Sicily. He had everything he wanted there. He got it very much how he wanted it, but he just never actually spent that much time there, unfortunately, because he was constantly off here, there, and everywhere. I don't think there are that many actual pictures or paintings of it. It's a shame, really, because it would have probably been the most beautiful. It's weird though. He lived there with Emma and William for a time. I feel like I just need to mention that. So him, his mistress, and his mistress's husband all lived there together, and it's a very strange situation to be in. In terms of what it looked like, I don't think there are that many pictures of Merton Place.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it exists still, as far as I'm aware. And there's a tiny plaque saying where it used to be, and I know Nelson referred to it as Paradise Merton, so he obviously thought very fondly of it, or he wouldn't have called it that. I think there are some accounts of the weekly expenditure and books that he'd bought. I remember someone sharing something recently that they'd found. I don't know where they found it, but it was a list of books that Nelson had bought just before Trafalgar, which obviously he never got to read because they were delivered whilst he was away, unfortunately. Yeah, it's a shame. They had to sell it in, I think, 1808, 1809, something like that, because Emma had no money. And despite being told Nelson saying, you know, I'm leaving her as a legacy to my country and asking everyone to look after her, that very much did not happen, which is a shame. But yeah, I don't think Nelson spent very much time there. I mean, it was huge. I think it's about 70 acres, which is some prime real estate in London nowadays.
You do have, I think you have had some of the toughest ones to field just because his life was cut short.
I got 47, so.
Mm-hmm. And this one I think is easier. It's pretty straightforward. I think it's a matter of technicality. From @JustSomeGuyJohn. Why don't we refer to Nelson as the Duke of Bronte?
That was actually only one of his titles by that point. He was given it. So after the Nile, he went to Naples. He took the king and his family on HMS Vanguard off to Sicily, which is, like I said, where him and Lady Hamilton kind of became a thing. And as a token of thanks for getting them out and evacuating them, King Ferdinand made Nelson the Duke of Bronte. It's this small town near Mount Etna, and the estate actually still exists. And like I said, Nelson had all of these paintings and things shipped there. He never actually visited, unfortunately, which is a shame. So yeah, he was the first Duke of Bronte. When he died, it then passed to his older brother, William Nelson, who was actually not a very nice guy. And then he also took on Nelson's title after the Nile, Baron Nelson of the Nile. And then the title of Duke of Bronte passed to his daughter, who married Samuel Hood, who was second Baron Bridport, and now it's subsequently gone down through the Hood family, who are obviously another famous naval name. But yeah, I mean, it was just one of his orders of merit, I suppose, and not his main title, I guess.
And as a foreign order.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to say, on a technicality,
it's not held in as much esteem, I suppose, as Baron Nelson of the Nile given to him by Britain.
Yeah.
I mean, he still signed off most of it. He signed off a lot of letters with Nelson and Bronte. It would be the same as being given something. I can't think of anything. If you're the Duke of, you're going to use the one that's from your home country, is the one that's going to be seen by at least Britain to be the most important.
Can you, so Marcus, can you give a brief summary of Wellington's logistical system in the peninsula and a favourite Wellington quote from a questing vole.
Questing role. So there's kind of two questions there, isn't there? So I will.
It is just. I mean,
Okay, well, it's the logistical system. I've talked about it earlier. I mean, it's not the cutting edge, fascinating part, but it's what Wellington did very well. He inherited two main areas, which was the commissariat and the wagon corps, later the Royal Wagon Corps. And the commissariat were actually funded and run by the Treasury, as they were technically civilians outside of all of the army and military system. And Wellington was ridiculously frustrated with them. So when they went overseas, basically to do the job for the army in the peninsula or anywhere, they actually took a pay cut, which meant that they were in charge of basically the actual supplies, the stores, and areas like that, and making sure the clothes, the ammunition, the food were stored and accounted for. So they're effectively clerks. They were meant to have taken like a literacy exam, but we've got letters where some of them could barely write. And I've got a quote from Wellington where he said, "The neglect and incapacity of some officers of the commissariat, which we have suffered and we're suffering still." And apparently Picton, famously quite a various Welshman, he actually threatened to hang some of the commissariat officers on sight because they were doing such a bad job. So he had real problems with that. The other half of it was the Royal Wagon Corps. Wellington wrote that he couldn't really criticise them, otherwise they'd all desert. And so they were interesting lots, and they did actually have a really tough job because they had like 2-horse wagons. They had to trundle across all of the peninsula carrying supplies to and from the depots, and they were given the jobs of drivers. But Wellington, what he did really well with them was expand it. And but I think by the end they've had 14 troops, so that's like 14 squadrons of cavalry, so over 2,000 men of wagon corps. So they'd amalgamated in the Irish wagon corps as well. So he did logistics really well. On top of that, he had his adjutant generals, which were more for like bureaucracy in areas, but it was a complicated system in the peninsula for his logistical system. But Wellington realised early on that it was also really important. He also worked very closely with his Spanish and Portuguese allies to try to ensure that food was in the right place. My favourite Wellington anecdote. So, I mean, there's so many. I really love Sparrowhawk's mom when he said to the Queen Victoria how to get rid of her sparrows. But as an anecdote, I think Battle of Salamanca, where he's watching the French army expand and they've got a gap, basically, and he can exploit it. And he's famously eating a chicken leg, cold chicken leg. And he just sees this. He chucks the chicken leg over his shoulder and said, "By God, that will do." Starts ordering his army forwards. So that's my favourite Wellington anecdote. I've also got to say, I looked up a quote because it is my favourite one. It said about Wellington is from Queen Victoria herself, because she said the country's loss was irreparable, and he was the greatest man this country ever produced, the most devoted and loyal subject, and the staunchest supporter the crown ever had. So it just puts into context how important Wellington was.
Not throwing shade on Nelson there at all.
Victoria said Wellington was the greatest man ever, so
just saying.
Mic drop.
Yeah. Kate, what did Nelson? It's famous, and it's famously noted, and Marcus said this earlier about Wellington. Wellington considered the Battle of Assaye in 1803 in India as the greatest thing he did by way of fighting. I will expand slightly on that and say that this opinion changed slightly throughout his life. He went through about 3 battles. Because he lived longer and was able to progress in his military career, he was able to choose his favourite battles, and amongst them were I think Vittoria was one. Waterloo did count as his greatest achievement that he thought, but he thought that the greatest thing he did as a military feat was the battle he fought in India in 1803. I have a question here that runs through that preamble and then cuts to what did Nelson consider his greatest victory? And I think that it would probably be, much like Wellington, an evolving thing as he went on throughout his life.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said earlier, I mean, Cape St. Vincent was his first kind of look at me moment, and he wrote enough letters telling everyone. And then obviously after that, I think it would be the Nile. I mean, the Nile is the battle that more than any other established him as a name, as a famous sort of person, I guess. And actually, it's a really interesting battle to look at because it started at sunset, which is very much unheard of. You fought in daylight because you could see ships. I mean, it obviously stands to reason why you would do that. And it's very close to the mouth of the Nile in Abu Qir Bay. And the French were at anchor, and Nelson kind of had this, I mean, he'd been chasing the French around for a while, and he saw this opportunity and he took it, and it worked. And like I said earlier, we were talking about his band of brothers. Everyone knew the plan, and the plan worked. And if that was his moment where he wanted to give the French a battering, he very much did it, to the extent that when Lorient burst into flames and was destroyed, some of the wood from the mast was kept and made into a coffin for Nelson. And actually he got buried in the mast of the French flagship at the Nile, which is another little, I mean, it's very Nelson. It's all I would say. But I mean, partly that was Nelson just seeing the opportunity, and partly it was the French underestimating him, I think, because the French were at anchor, and they, you know, I think it must have been about 6 o'clock in the evening or something, and they just didn't think he was going to attack because that just wasn't what you did. And then the wind was going basically all the way along the French line, and Nelson split his fleet into 2 groups and snaked through this gap, and the French were just completely caught unawares. They had absolutely no idea what was going on. And whilst a few of the ships ran aground on the shoals, it was just chaos, really. And the British did a really clever thing. Someone asked me recently whether ships use lanterns in battles, and actually Nile was a really interesting one, because we put lanterns all along the stern cabins, and at the sort of the mizzen peak, I guess, so that you could distinguish our ships in the dark from the French, meaning that the French took a battering. And I can't think of that many other naval battles that have been fought at nighttime, especially not at this time. And the idea to have all of his captains doing this, and everyone knew what was going on, and the French had no idea what was going on, because it was just sort of unheard of, really. And I think in the end, only 2 French ships of the line actually got away, and a couple of frigates. I think Nelson thought at one point he'd gone blind. There's a famous painting in the Admiralty boardroom in London, which people have seen recently, where there's like a scar on Nelson's head, and a flap of skin actually came down over his eye, and he thought he was blind, and it was very quickly sewn up together, and he resumed command. And I think that's probably, I don't know if he would have said it was his most, like, his favourite battle or whatever, but I think that was certainly the one that people wanted to know about. The news took so long. I think the news didn't actually reach London until October, and the battle took place in August. So it took a really long time. No one knew whether we'd won or lost, and he was obviously made Baron Nelson of the Nile. He was given, I think, £10,000 by the East India Company, and all of these different people were giving him swords and Order of the Crescent and all that. You know, I think that would probably be the one. And it left Napoleon's army kind of stranded and cut off from France, and the French couldn't get to India. And I think the Nile is probably, I would go on for hours about the Nile if I could, but the Nile,
I would be happy to let you as well, because it is a fascinating battle.
I think that would be the one that I would pick.
I think that's a good choice, I think, as well. We have another one doing the 2-1-2-1. We have another one here which is another one from Diary's Empire, which goes that Alexander the Great wept when he had no new worlds to conquer. How well would Nelson have coped post-Trafalgar?
Terribly, I think. I mean, he probably would have stayed in the Navy a while longer. It's not to say he wouldn't, but I mean, at that point, obviously, if you're not fighting at sea to the extent that you were, there would have been a huge number of people put onto half pay, and I think Nelson probably would have been one of them. I think he would have been given his earldom. Is it an earldom? Is that what you call it? He would have been made an or something, like Earl Trafalgar, like Earl St Vincent, etc. And I think he would have just gone off to Paradise Merton probably. And from letters that I've read by Nelson, I think he probably would have sulked quite quite a bit and been a little bit peeved that he couldn't go off. I think he probably would have stayed in touch with the Navy to some extent and found a way to involve himself in any way that he could. But I don't think that he would have been at sea as much, because by that point I think that Trafalgar still would have been his pinnacle, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So can I pose you one, Kate? Because I'm listening to that thinking. Would we have remembered Nelson in the same way if he hadn't died?
We've gone off script. We've gone off script. What's happening?
I'm listening to Kate and I want to learn.
I actually covered that in a talk about Trafalgar, and some people got really grumpy at me because I said that actually part of the reason we remember Trafalgar so much is because Nelson died. And people went, no, we remember Trafalgar because it stopped the threat of invasion. And I was like, yeah, that's fine. But if you mention the Nile, which was also it wasn't as decisive a battle as Trafalgar, certainly, but you mention the Nile and people sort of go, yeah, it's a river. They don't really know about the battle. But you say Trafalgar, and because of all of this memorialization of Nelson, everyone knows about it. Or well, a lot of people know about it. I don't think it would have anywhere near the fame, I guess, that it has now if Nelson hadn't died. I think he died at the top of his career. Everyone loved him, and people mourned. I mean, Nelson's funeral, if you look into it, it was huge. It was a state funeral. People were lining the streets from about 4 o'clock in the morning. Thousands of people went to see his body in Greenwich, and I think there were even, I can't remember the number of people, but there were people causing stampedes in Greenwich to be able to see Nelson's body. It was a huge thing, and I don't think Trafalgar would have been remembered as much. I think it would have been remembered, but certainly not as much if Nelson had survived.
I think his funeral was almost, it was in the top percentage of almost being as big as Wellington's. Not quite, but up there.
Is that the whole reason you asked this question?
No, it's always interesting to know people that if they quietly go down in history, or if I agree. I think it was remembered because of his death, but I was just interested.
That brings us to Marcus's question, which is which of Napoleon's marshals was Wellington at most like? Now, that's by at J.L. Wayner. Now, I was specifically asked to ask you this question and not allow you to compare Wellington to Napoleon. Now, this, I think, should make your question incredibly easy.
Oh, really?
Carry on.
Well, I saw this one online. I have to admit, I did some reading because not comparing him to Napoleon makes it, I thought, really hard. So I was instantly wanting to compare him to Davout, the Iron Marshal, but I don't think Wellington was a disciplinarian in the same way. So it's been really difficult, but I believe it was Wellington who said that it was Marmont who kept him awake. So I'm gonna go with Marmont from my readings anyway, because they kind of had similar backgrounds. So we're talking about similarities. They're both of minor aristocracy. They're both professional officers with training, and they faced each other at Salamanca. And they were both politicians after the war, and they actually both died in 1852. So their careers have some similarities on there. But there's also a lot of marshals who never faced Wellington, and that's where it really struggles, because the similarities are very hard parallels to draw. Mm-hmm. So because there's so many, I'm going to say Marmont, and we'll go with that.
Okay. And that's what the important thing is. My opinion doesn't matter at all, because you are the one on Wellington's side here. But I think that the person who posed that question was a little unfair to you in not allowing you to compare him to Napoleon, because he did beat every marshal that he came across, and of course beat Napoleon as well. That's just to throw shade on Napoleon. There's nothing to do with Nelson. So that brings us back to Kate, and I think the probably amongst the last of the questions for you. You did touch on this earlier. This is referring to Naples again. How does Nelson's controversial actions at Naples colour his reputation, and how does it compare to Wellington's biggest controversy? Actually, this is actually for both people then. This has actually been given to me by a member of my family. I have two questions here that were given to me verbally by members of my family. And how does Nelson's controversial actions at Naples colour his reputation, and how does it compare to Wellington's biggest controversy?
Okay. I mean, I'm not going to go into too much detail about Naples because I've sort of covered it already.
Yeah, you did.
But it's safe to say that obviously, like I said, the Admiralty and the government were not happy, and they tried to sort of move themselves away from Nelson. But I don't know that it coloured his reputation as such, because I don't want to say it was swiftly forgotten, because suddenly the news of this victory, I don't want to say it was forgotten, but it seems to have been very much kind of swept under the rug, because Nelson is a hero and Nelson's won these battles, and look at Nelson, isn't he great? Unfortunately, he died. You know, we can't speak ill of him because he beat the French at Trafalgar. But unfortunately, it wasn't a good period of his life. And the book by Jonathan North, like I said, is actually excellent, and it looks into it in so much more detail. I mean, if you look at this sort of period of his life in a Nelson biography, there's a few paragraphs or in a tiny bit of a chapter sort of hidden away in the middle, because mostly it's look at how great Nelson was. And this book goes in on him, I think, is
Okay.
language you would use, and it looks at letters and all these documents, and you read it and you just get a completely different picture of Nelson as a human. I mean, that's not to say that he's not a hero, and it's not to say that you should play down any of his victories, but it certainly wasn't something to be proud of. I don't think I'd go as far as calling him a war criminal. It wasn't good.
Right.
But I don't think it coloured his how people perceived him, because I think there was so much praise for Nelson and so much memorialization that it kind of overshadowed it. And it's only really more recently that people have started looking into Naples more. I think before this there had been a couple of sort of journal articles done and things like that, but this is a whole. I mean, it's not a small book either. It's quite, and it's just on Nelson in Naples, and it covers this in huge detail, and especially the fact that he was given orders and completely ignored them, which he did a lot actually. But in this regard, he was given orders, ignored them, and people were executed when they shouldn't have been. And that doesn't go down well with anyone. So Nelson was recalled to Britain. He got back in November, and the news of the denial had got there in October. Like that. I think by that point people would have kind of forgotten about it. The important people probably didn't forget about it.
Yeah.
And there are a few people that didn't turn up to Nelson's funeral. I'm not saying that was why, it wasn't why, but I think it was St. Vincent who on numerous occasions was given an invite to Nelson's funeral and said, no, I have bad eyes, I can't make it. And then he was seen out horse riding for
Okay.
But yeah, I don't think it coloured his reputation as much as probably it should have.
Okay. And so, Marcus, how does that moment in Nelson's life compare, say, to Wellington's? Does he have anything comparable, do you think, to that?
Well, I was trying to think, but it's very different because it's political in the military sphere is the Treaty of Sintra. So we're talking about recalling, and so after the Battle of Mario, in fact, he'd actually been supplanted that day, that morning, and the commander was actually on a ship, I believe, in Lisbon. And Wellington had gone out that morning to check his lines, and he saw the battle taking place. So he fought a defensive battle and won the Battle of Mario. And basically, at the closing stages, these other generals effectively turn up and go, "Thanks for fighting the battle. We'll now take over," and let the French army walk away with all their weapons, all their standards, all their flags, and enough, basically. And in fact, they actually loaded them onto ships and shipped them back to France. We went even further. We gave them a taxi home at the end of the night. So it was terrible. And Wellington was recalled so that they could do this investigation into it. Now, everybody involved was actually found not guilty. But I think historians normally come down on that fact that the other generals involved that supplanted Wellington were really guilty. They should have been having more than just a slap on the wrist. And Wellington luckily went back out. Now, unfortunately, in between it all, Napoleon actually arrives in Spain just very briefly, and Sir John Moore retreats. winning the Battle of Corunna during the retreats. Terrible retreat, lots of people really suffering in the snow up to the north of Spain. But Sir John Moore gives his life at the end of the battle, but the battle's actually won in quite a Trafalgar-esque way, actually. And poor Sir John Moore, one of the fathers of the Light Division and the Rifles, dies. And I think if we hadn't had the Treaty of Sintra and the retreat to Corunna, then Sir John Moore would have lived. So that's the controversy there. But it's not Wellington's fault. It's the other generals and the political masters for recalling him, unfortunately.
Right. Yes. So there's not a huge ability to compare. I think you're right. It's probably the closest you can get, but there obviously there's not the slightly darker side. Let me see. We have now Wellington vs Davout. Who wins?
Well, as I said before, so Davout was a disciplinarian, which is really difficult. But Davout was also like one of the masters of logistics. So Davout and Wellington actually have some similarities with their logistical abilities that some of the other marshals in Spain completely ignored, and they just went around kind of pillaging off the peasantry. It's also worthy of saying that Davout, actually, because he was a disciplinarian, would have stopped all the raping and pillaging, I believe, as much so. Whereas the other marshals seemed to be using it as a weapon and did horrendous things. So Davout would have been better for Spain and the poor peasants that got wrapped up in the war. Who would have won militarily? I think it's too big a what if. He was certainly one of the most talented, but Wellington time and time again saw off, Massena, Soult, Marmont, and if they couldn't do it with armies that were sometimes like 5,000 men bigger, and they normally had at least a dozen guns more, would the personality of Davout change it? I don't know. I think the army, Wellington's army was good. His commanders were good. The men were good at what they did, and Wellington was Wellington. So
and now that is actually you after questions, Marcus. So we'll now go to Kate until the end with battery. Kate, a very simple one probably next. Did Nelson really say "kiss me, Hardy," and why?
Yeah, yes is the short answer. So you have this famous story of Nelson dying below on the orlop deck of Victory, and all of the the stories are "kiss me, Hardy," and Hardy kisses him, and then he says, "Thank God I've done my duty," and dies. And I think it was the Victorians who changed that and decided that it wasn't proper for two men to be kissing each other, so it became kismet, which is fate, and it was Kismet Hardy. But if you look at the journals, I guess, memoirs of people who were actually there when Nelson died, so you've got the surgeon Beatty, you've got other people who were down there, and I think there's 3 or 4 different accounts of when Nelson died, and they all say that he asked Hardy to kiss him, and Hardy actually kissed him twice, once on the cheek and once on the forehead. And they were very, very close, very good friends, and they'd served together for a very long time, actually. And so I don't think it's beyond comprehension for that to have happened. And I genuinely do think it happened, because I mean you've got 3 people against the Victorians who were very very proper with how they did things, I suppose. And yeah, so I'm happy to say that yes, Nelson did say "kiss me, Hardy."
Yes, I agree as well, because Nelson was a 18th century man as well, and in the 18th century, in the Georgian era, even Wellington was much more comfortable with, say, taking a man by the arm and walking around with him than the Victorians were comfortable with. So, coming after that, a question that talks to tactics, and is it fair to say Nelson came by his big successes by breaking the rules and relying a great deal on luck?
I'd certainly agree with the second part, and I think to some extent the first part. So Cape St. Vincent, he definitely didn't stay in the line, and I think it's that seeing the opportunity there. I think it comes down partly to luck, but partly to just being a very good seaman, and understanding the movement of ships and fully understanding everything that needed to happen. I think, especially for Cape St. Vincent, he saw what was happening ahead of it, even starting to happen, saw the gap and went for it, and it worked. obviously that wasn't the done thing, and he'd completely gone against what he'd been told to do, but it worked to his advantage. I don't think you could say the same for Copenhagen. That was a bit of a cock up as well. I mean, they had all the best intentions of going in and laying all this is Copenhagen 1801, of course. They went in, laid all the voyage, and then realised that all the voyage was in fact wrong. And again, it sort of worked in Nelson's favour, because he could see what was happening and went, okay, no, I know that you're the master, but don't go this way. We're going to go this way because that's where the deep water is, and I'm sure of it. And it was, and it worked out for him. The Nile, again, it was more seeing opportunity and luck, the French underestimating him more than anything else, I would say. And for Trafalgar, I think this whole breaking the line idea is always put forward to Nelson, but Nelson was not the first person to do it by any means. Nelson's remembered the most for it, but I think it was actually done by Rodney at the Saints.
Hawke as well, possibly.
Yeah. I don't think it was new. I think the way that Nelson went around communicating was new, but not the way he went around the tactics per se. I mean, ships all move in the same way. They all need to predict weather to their advantage. And Nelson was very good at seeing a way to use that gap and use the weather and use things that perhaps other people hadn't seen, and make the most of it, and it worked for him. And yeah, he did obviously disobey orders quite a lot. I mean, in Naples, he was disobeying orders. He turned down going to Minorca and completely ignored it. So I mean, he ignored plenty of orders, and I'm sure he thought he knew best, which is why I think he wouldn't have worked very well some kind of dual command amphibious operation. But I think mostly it was down to being a good seaman than luck.
I think that sounds right when it comes to that. And we should also point out that not to rely too much, Marcus, on Napoleon, but he did say that a good general relies a great deal on luck, and Napoleon did know a thing or two about winning and how people win.
And luck.
and luck indeed. And that brings us to the last of the questions, guys.
Right.
Did you have a good time?
Yes.
It's a nice variation in that. I enjoyed that.
Right. Well, thank you, Kate and Marcus, for answering all those questions and for talking with me for so long. I want to also thank everybody who got involved and has taken the polls and has asked questions. I'm not really sure if we really ever intended to declare one man the winner over the other, but the results are there for everybody to see from the questions and from our two speakers tonight. Thank you all again. Thank you all for watching. Have a good week, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.